Welcome back, everybody. This is Neil Dailey with McGraw Commercial Properties. On board with me again is Rich Marshall of Connor and Winters, and we are talking today about some fairly specific information that you will see a lot of times in not only contracts, but more specifically in leases, things that we come across and things that you should know about. And that is assignments and subleasing. So subletting, subleasing, the assignment itself, what are the differences, et cetera. So Rich, tell me, what is an assignment in basic terms?
Well, an assignment is a situation. We'll discuss it. Let's say in a lease context. So, an assignment, from a tenant's perspective, what they are doing is they're basically relinquishing their rights to the lease space, and they're giving them to a new party via the assignment.
All right.
All the rights. So, on a true assignment, once that occurs, if I assign my 800 square foot office space to you, Neil, at that point, you, Neil, are the quote unquote de facto tenant of that location.
So you leave, I come in and assume all rights and responsibilities that are under that lease document.
Correct.
Right. And
correct.
You leaving out, no further responsibility. You're off the hook.
It depends. And that's where it's important from a landlord's perspective. What I would want to do as a landlord is say, okay, Rich, I'm okay with you assigning the 800 square feet to Neil, but I still want you, Rich, to be on the hook, to be liable in the event Neil doesn't perform.
Is there a term for that? Is it something where it would be a limited assignment? I've never seen a term, but you always have to read the details.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any magical term to it. It's really just provision that is typically in most commercial leases that's going to indicate whether upon the assignment is the assignor, which would be me, am I still liable to the landlord in the event you, as the assignee of the space, don't properly perform. Smart landlords will require that. They will require that I, as original tenant, stay on the hook for liability, because they, at the initial component of the lease, they basically underwrote me as the tenant and my ability to perform. Right. And they don't want to give that up unless they have to.
A lot of times we talk about strength of tenant, and that's some judgment that's made on either financials or creditworthiness, sometimes personal guarantees. A lot of times landlords will let somebody off the hook in the event they catch a bigger fish. If the strength is drastically improved, or it works out to somehow the landlord is now more secure or benefits more from that tenant. Do you see that more common?
Yeah, it's fairly common, especially in the commercial lease context. Oftentimes there'll be provisions in the assignment clause that will allow the tenant to assign its interest in the lease, provided certain things are met. And a lot of times, one of the things that is listed in there as a condition to satisfy is that the assignee has to have a certain creditworthiness amount. Sometimes it's a number. Sometimes the landlord will put in a number that says the assignee has to have a net assets greater than $3 million, $10 million, whatever it is for the deal. Other times it may be a little more nebulous. It says that the assignee has to have the equal to or greater than the creditworthiness of the original tenant. And that's where it gets a little bit more nebulous as to what does that really mean. But those are pretty common provisions in assignments. So at the end of the day, the landlord wants to know if we're going to assign it to somebody, I want to know as a landlord that I've got someone stepping into this deal that's a good performer and has the financial wherewithal to satisfy the terms of the lease.
Now, before we move on to the difference between sublet and assignments, a lot of times you'll see language that is encouraged to be put in at the end of that paragraph that says that landlord shall allow this assignment or sublease, or that the permission shall not be unreasonably withheld. I see that specific phrase pushed in a lot of different instances, whereas the landlord is now required to be lenient. Is that enforceable by any means?
Yeah. So just as a big picture, most transactional attorneys hate those words.
Yeah.
The words reasonable or material. On the flip side, litigators love those words. And as you can guess why, because it opens up the Pandora's box. That's, well, what is reasonable in this situation, or what is material as far as a material default. So if you can, it's always best to try to avoid those words as a transactional person, to give complete clarity and concreteness to the provision that can't be attacked by a litigator saying, oh, no, this says landlord won't unreasonably withhold its consent. It just opens the door for a fight. And the old joke is the only people who make money in litigation are the lawyers. And a lot of times that's true.
Yeah.
So I would encourage people to be very precise in their language and try to avoid using reasonable consent language in assignment or sublet context, and be very concrete if you can as to what are the parameters that would allow a consent to occur. And a lot of times what will happen is even if they have that language that you just mentioned about the landlord won't unreasonably withhold, they'll go further and say, the following is a list of things that would constitute landlord's ability to deny consent. So they go even further after that. But
right.
Trying to avoid the reasonableness standard is best in all transactional documents to the extent you can.
I see that sometimes as more of a benefit to the tenant in that situation than the landlord.
Absolutely.
Right? Because the landlord is, I'm leasing out the space, I'm doing a deal with you. In the event that something doesn't go well for you and you need to assign this, you're looking for more flexibility from me, and you're trying to open up the vagueness of this, or, or the argument of why it should be, either unreasonable or reasonable.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So let's talk about the difference between subletting and assignment.
So we talked about assignment, which basically I'm basically conveying all of my rights and duties and obligations under the lease to you, and then you're going to take them over. Under a sublet, it's a little different. Basically, under a sublet, I'm going to allow you to utilize my space under a sublease, for example, but I'm still ultimately obligated under my main lease to the landlord for all performance. I'm not off the hook in a sublease context. I'm still ultimately beholden to the landlord under the main lease for the performance of everything. So it's for the person sitting in the middle, which is the original tenant, the sublease can be a little bit dicey because you're still in the crosshairs, if you will, of the obligations under the main lease.
I think this example can be really conveyed if you think about in a college situation where someone's ever been in an apartment and you have to rent it for the entire year, and you graduate at the semester and you got to find somebody to come in and pay your rent for the summer.
Right.
And they don't take very good care of the house. Now you're going to be responsible and lose your security deposit.
Yeah.
Right. So you got to go back in, you got to make sure it's clean, it's been kept, you know, make sure the bills are paid. All the items in the lease are held true. It's an ideal scenario for the subtenant in a lot of cases, unless it's arranged properly. Give me some strategy on how you would arrange a sublease. If you are the tenant and you're subleasing the space, what are some ways that you think that you can protect yourself?
Well, I think, again, one of the things you want to do is you want to make sure you underwrite your subtenant. You want to make sure that from a financial perspective, they're strong and they can perform financially. If they have a prior track record of being a lessee or a sublessee of commercial real estate space, that would be good to know and understand.
Right.
And the other thing, a couple of other things you can do is I think you would want to try to get a decent amount of a security deposit to kind of buffer a situation in the event they fail to perform, or as you just mentioned on an apartment context, they just don't take care of the property. And the other component is you want to have the ability to have frequent kind of ability to walk in and monitor and inspect, just to see that the property is being taken care of during the term of the sublease.
I would say a lot of times in the situation where you're trying to sublease, you're almost desperate for whoever comes along. That smells pretty bad a lot of times. And I think subtenants can take advantage of that. They're going to drive down the rate. They know that you're just trying to mitigate as much as you can. If you're in that situation, you may be a little more lax on who you take. And so is there any language you think that you can use and help to try and protect yourself? Certainly from the notice period, you want to be notified if anything happens or if they're in default in some way.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot that you can do because typically in most subleases, what most people will do in subleases is they'll just kind of follow the lease terms. So whatever the tenant has as far as obligations under the lease, the subtenant kind of acquires those and just kind of picks them up via the sublease itself. There are situations where you can look to get sublease guarantees. So get a third party that has
Oh
some
yeah,
financial wherewithal to be a guarantor of the sublease.
that's a whole nother
Uh,
world in
that's
itself, isn't it?
that's helpful. The practicality, though, and I always say this with any type of guarantee, is in theory they look great, but in practicality, in order to enforce the guarantee, you're going to have to go sue that person. You're going to get a judgment, and then you got to go try to collect on the judgment. So it's not a slam dunk, but it's better than nothing. Uh, and the other thing I would encourage on a sublease context is, let's say if the rent is due, let's say the rent is due on the 5th of each month under the main lease. Under the sublease, make the rent due on the 1st of each month, so
Right.
that there is kind of a little buffer time to where you can get the rent received under the sublease and then in turn flip it and pay it directly to the landlord.
That's right, because you're going to be carrying it at some point if they're on the same date.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing that a lot of times you'll see in leases for the landlord's perspective is they will have what they call a right of recapture. So what that really means is if you go to the landlord and request either the ability to assign the lease or to sublet it, if there's a right of recapture language in the lease, the landlord can say, no, you know what, I'm not going to consent to that assignment. I'm just going to take back your space.
We've had an example of this before, and it wasn't necessarily in this market, but it was in a market where the prevailing rental rate was higher than the rate at which they were currently leasing. So they were in an equity position. So if they're at 15 bucks a square foot on the lease, and now the prevailing rate in town is now 20 or 25, they could sublease their space and make 5 or 10 bucks a square foot on that. That's where you as a landlord would want to make sure that you have the option to just take that space back.
Absolutely. Yeah. You hit the nail on the head as far as kind of the drivers for why the landlord wants that. They want that right either because, as you just mentioned, the prevailing market rate is considerably higher than what they're currently getting under the sublease. They may also want that right to hedge their bets in the event that the tenant has just been difficult to deal with
Right.
and or not performing. It gives them an ability to get out of the transaction. And sometimes there are situations where the landlord says, you know what, I may want to repurpose this space, or
Right.
I may want to use it for my own.
There's a
Having that
larger
right of
tenant next
recapture gives
door.
them that flexibility.
Yeah. You've got, this happens sometimes in retail situations where you've got an anchor tenant, and you would have language on either side of that anchor tenant and they would want to absorb them. Then you get into relocation clauses and all that kind of stuff. But
Yeah, I'll give you a quick example. This is not a right of recapture, but I'm working on a deal right now. It's in California, where the existing tenant. This is an anomaly, but the existing tenant is paying about $27,000 a month for some warehouse space.
right.
However, they have it subleased for $56,000 a month,
It's great.
and there's no cost sharing between the tenant and the landlord of that overage amount under this lease. So what this landlord's waiting to do is they're waiting for that main lease to expire, which will expire in a couple more years, and they're going to go directly to the existing subtenant and say, hey, it's time to do a direct sub. Instead of doing a sublease, do a direct lease with us.
Right.
And instead of paying $56,000 a month, we'll do it at $52,000 a month. So it's a win-win for both landlord and the existing subtenant to kind of let that main lease expire and then do a direct lease between themselves.
Yeah. You often get that as well. We just did a unique one here, whereas the subtenant only has a year and a half left on the primary term of the lease, but the new tenant coming in wanted to do an even 5 or 7 or potentially a 10-year deal. So we had to negotiate 2 different scenarios. So we're dealing with the tenant to occupy for a year and a half and then go direct with the landlord after that. And so there's a rate change, and how do we accommodate everybody's, it went smoother than I thought it would be, but I think that was mainly just because of timing, and there was pressure to get the deal done.
Yeah.
But it was interesting.
There are all kinds of nuances. The other thing that you will often see in the leases is they may expressly state that the right to assign or sublet is quote unquote personal to that tenant.
I
So
saw an example of this. Explain that.
so in that situation, what the landlord's really saying is let's say Neil, that you're the tenant of the lease, and the lease says that your right to assign or sublet is personal to you. What that really means is the landlord is okay considering, based on the parameters, you Neil assigning or subletting the space. But after you do that once, after you assign or sublet, let's say you assign in the lease to me, that provision no longer allows me to further assign the lease to somebody else,
Right.
because
So,
that assignment right was only personal to you, Neil. It didn't flow down to me as the second generation tenant under the assignment.
right. Now, as an attorney advising a landlord, how would you feel about the language where it says that tenant can do it to a wholly owned subsidiary? You know, they have the right to do that.
Yeah, those are pretty common. So a lot of times there'll be a right to assign or sublet to an entity owned or controlled or in common control with the current tenant.
Right.
What I would do as the landlord is allow that, but I would still, as we talked about earlier, I would make the original tenant still liable, as still remain liable on the lease in the event the assignee did not perform properly. So I would allow them to assign to an affiliate, for example, but I would say, however, the original tenant shall not be released from liability under this lease upon such assignment. So that way you have two parties to chase as the landlord if you need to for your payment performance obligations.
Anybody negotiating a lease out there right now, we're going to put Rich's contact information up on the screen here. Again, Rich Marshall with Connor and Winters. Any closing remarks, and the guys in regards to assignment and subletting?
I guess a closing remark would be don't just gloss over that provision. Think it through. Anytime you get into real estate deals, either landlord, tenant, buyer, or seller, you're always thinking about exit strategy and flexibility. So try to negotiate as much as you can to give yourself that flexibility.
Awesome. Rich, thanks again. I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk with me and the folks out there that are watching this to learn a little bit more about the specifics of this stuff. I really enjoy digging into a lot of this stuff. It's especially beneficial for new agents that we have in the office to talk about lease clauses and why they're important. Obviously, if it's in a lease, it's in there for a reason. This is one that you see every time. And these are interesting observations and options that you could put in there when you're negotiating with those, both from the tenant side and from the landlord side. Thank you. All right. Until next time. All right. Again, I'm Neil Dailey with McGraw Commercial Properties, Rich Marshall with Connor and Winters, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks.
Thanks.